Welcome back, church family, to this episode of the Deeper Podcast. So glad that you joined us again this week. And I'm going to introduce myself because I'm only here every other week. Is how the rhythm's been. And I'm actually gone next week. So Jeremy Wynn, Outreach and Discipleship Team Lead here at the church, joined by Doug Congdon.
Doug Congdon, professional golfer and NBA player. Brian?
NBA 2K player.
Hey-yo. Actually, no, sadly. I've never played that, but continue.
We got Brian Trias. Is this week 3 in a row for you?
I don't know.
Ugh,
man.
If so,
I think
who's putting this together?
I think I was on last week. Guilty.
2 weeks in a row. That's still about as much as we can handle of you.
That's what most people say.
You're not going to have a lie about what you do? What do you do, Brian?
I'm the pastor of ministries, which means I do things.
And on the side, you are a handyman.
I
Mr.
go
Do-it-all.
to children's sporting events. I
So lame.
I don't lie well.
That's good. That's positive.
Yeah.
Okay. So it is that like time of year I've noticed where I wake up and I put on sweatpants and a sweatshirt, and then around noon I'm sweating profusely, and I'm like, man, I really should have brought a change of clothes.
Or not worn sweatpants to work.
Well,
either way.
I mean, that's a different discussion. But that change of season also generally means that we are in playoff baseball time. And we like to have our quick question of the day, in some senses, include like a special connection to our guest. And our guest here is Brian. Most of you probably don't know, because it doesn't make any sense, that Brian is a Baltimore Orioles baseball fan. And do you want to give the quick story on why you root for the Orioles?
I lived in Herndon, Virginia from 1983 to 1991. And when I lived there, there were no Washington Nationals and there were no Baltimore Ravens.
Oh, man.
So I was a Washington Redskins at the time fan, and I was a Baltimore Orioles fan. And my Baltimore Orioles fandom started when they were 0-21 to start the 1987 season. And Cal Ripken Jr. hit a home run to break the streak, and I was hooked.
Wow.
So, me starting with a 1-21 team makes the last couple of days much easier to digest.
For sure. And that makes so much more sense about why you always have low expectations for all of your sports teams.
I have low expectations for everything, Douglas.
Okay, so hopefully those of you listening are like paying attention to the fact that the Royals are in the playoffs for the first time in 9 years.
Mm-hmm.
Swept, which still feels weird in a 3-game series, swept the Orioles
They did.
2-0. And I'm just curious, how are you feeling, Brian, about that? Like 10 straight, 11 straight playoff losses, 10 straight playoff losses for the Orioles now? Have you given up? Will you give up?
No. I mean, if I would have given up, there was many more opportunities to give up when they were like one of the worst teams in baseball year after year after year. And so them making the playoffs is a good thing. But if you had been watching them all season, you would have known in mid-July that even if they made the playoffs, this was going to happen.
In mid-July, you saw the writing on the wall. That's a long time. That's like 100 games ago.
Okay. In a usual rotation.
Okay.
In a rotation.
Yeah.
How many pitchers are in a rotation?
Well, actually, should we have Jeremy since we're testing his baseball? Jeremy, how many pitchers do you think are in a normal MLB team rotation?
Oh, 4 to 5.
5.
Okay.
Teams used to do 4, but it's 5 now. Of their 5 opening day, starter pitchers, they only have 4 of them.
So 4 out of 5.
They're still in the range.
That's great.
I'm sorry. They only have 1 of them.
There we go.
I was like,
4 of
that's
them.
pretty normal for one person.
4 of them are gone.
Traded, injured, dead,
injured.
Okay.
Our main cog in the bullpen, the Mountain, Felix Bautista, he was gone. Didn't pitch once this season, and the team was decimated by injuries.
Jeez. Okay.
And their all-star catcher, who was the starting all-star catcher, like the league figured him out. And starting in July, he has not been able to hit.
Who is it?
Adley Rutschman.
Adley, your boy, you love him.
I love Adley Rutschman, but he hasn't been able to hit. And so, like, what I watched over the last 2 days was remarkably consistent with who they've been. And so
thought it was
there was nothing
anyway.
shocking.
Okay.
I had multiple people texting me about like, ha ha ha, we're going to beat you. And I said, yes, you are.
He just undercuts the joy. It's like, you can't brag about it. He's just like, whatever. I knew it was going to happen.
So I'm glad they made the playoffs.
Yeah.
A little bit of solace in Commanders having a amazing start to their season.
Great point.
Liverpool's like flying
Great
right now.
point.
Oh,
Yeah,
goodness.
his
You know, we're
random
We're stretching.
Texas.
Texas.
Is, so like
Again,
and
Brian's
my
teams,
theory,
guys, they're
my
all over the
theory,
place, yeah.
We draw a
not
map
all
of
of
them.
my teams can be doing well at once.
Yes.
And
okay.
so if the Commanders are starting to do well, it meant the
Mhm.
Orioles had to suffer for that.
Your
So.
weird sports karma. That's so
I
strange.
just know it's fun to live in Kansas and cheer for the Chiefs and the Royals,
Yep.
isn't it?
It is right
And
now.
that'll be
It is
really great when
simple,
they both
too.
move to Kansas here in a few
Oh
years.
yeah. I did. Never mind.
Make us
so
more of a fun state.
part of our question we were talking about the Royals Orioles series was looking at Jeremy
Mhm.
and asking Jeremy how many players can you actually name on the Royals team right now? Now, do you want me to give you? I'm going to help you a little bit on the front end by just saying there was a period at like right after the trade deadline where I followed the Royals relatively well, and I like opened my ESPN app to check on the game and saw 3 names in our starting lineup that I had never seen before, and there was no news about acquiring them in a big trade. So it has changed a lot this season. So you have a little bit of grace, but who would you throw some names out there?
So I hate that I knew this question was coming, but I was specifically told you cannot look up stuff, and I hate losing, and so
So we looked it up.
it's just annoying. I know 2 players.
Okay.
I know Bobby Witt Jr. and I know Salvi.
So, all right.
Okay,
Beyond that, you guys were joking.
first base. Do you know first base?
It's not
No,
Mustafa.
If I
there's no
gave
way.
you
There's
if I
no way.
gave you a nickname, do you want to try it?
No,
The Pasquatch.
I do not know.
That's a great nickname, though.
Vinny
and
Pasquantino.
it's like built in
Okay.
there, which is nice.
yeah.
But I'm excited to start tuning in more to the Royals games and
Now
getting to
that
know
we're
the
in
players now that
round
we're in the
2 of
playoffs.
the
So what you
playoffs.
should know about them is you have a guy named Tommy Pham who
Yeah.
came over in a midseason trade. His most famous thing he's known for
Yeah.
is being in a fantasy football league with a bunch of other players and punching Jock Peterson because they were bad about some fantasy football beef.
Now
That's
we
what
are-
he's most known for.
We are straying far from
Yes.
the topic.
Okay,
Yes.
good,
Yeah.
quick
We should do a sports
question.
podcast
Yeah,
one of
I
these
know
days.
I know
We'll
you
have to do a
want to.
bonus episode.
Go
with,
first of all,
some
go
of that.
Royals. Next game,
Yeah.
Yankees Saturday.
It's at like something 58, right?
Yeah, it is. It's
And
a
on
weird time
Monday,
frame.
you get the Monday Night Football and the baseball game at the same time. That's a
Unfortunate.
double TV.
Unfortunate.
Or come to Able, which
The
is
Chiefs-
still happening
The Chiefs
on
Saints
Monday
game
night.
is Monday night.
Monday
Yeah,
night.
they
It
play the
is?
Saints.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Cool.
All right, well, let's segue into what we're actually here to
Please
talk about.
segue us.
So we're in the last week, the last church of our series over the 7 churches. So in Revelation chapter 3, 14 through 22, we're talking about the church at Laodicea. Would one of you like to set the stage for this church? Brian,
Honestly, so good at that.
set the stage for this church, just some background. Anything else you want to include?
Yeah, honestly, I learned a lot about the background from listening to Joe in the run-through
Yeah,
message.
he did a great job
Yeah,
setting
I
it
thought
up.
he really did too. That it was a wealthy city. They had a lot. They were a city where even with an earthquake, he said that when things destroyed, they didn't ask the government for help. They kind of rebuilt it with their own wealth. So known for their wealth, they thought they were wealthy. But this is another one of those churches where there wasn't any positive things to say about them. And they were taking solace in their wealth and their possessions, but they weren't taking solace in their Savior. And this is where you get the famous,
Mm-hmm.
you are neither hot nor cold, and so I spit you out of your mouth. And one of the things Joe talked about with the city was that they didn't have water source. They had to have it through the aqueduct system, like brought to them. And so that would explain like how they got lukewarm water. So yeah.
Yeah. This is like when you think 7 churches, this is the one that you think of because I've heard many sermons on lukewarm Christianity and Jesus spitting us out of his mouth, but I have not heard about the other 6 churches that we've talked about. So this is the famous one that you will probably be most familiar with the passage with, at least.
Yeah, it was
And-
either the
and a-
first one or the last one, though. You've forgotten your first love.
Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
that's true.
That's true. Yep. And this is the one that Joe has said probably represents our church in America the most or the closest. So it should, where some of the stuff about suffering, hardship, persecution, death maybe isn't as relatable to where we're at. This one is very relatable to where we're at. So
Yeah, I would say this and Thyatira, the sexual stuff. So
Yeah, those are the
between
ones
one or
I
the
know.
others, those fit us pretty well.
yeah.
Yeah, the passage talked about how they consider themselves rich, prosperous, they need nothing. So definitely things that I think in the American church we can go to and could say is true about us.
Yeah.
Okay, so I got a couple questions today. And what I liked about as we crafted these questions, they're designed to be less about, hey, what are we going to do from this? And kind of just another thing that it feels like can stack upon itself. So we're going to start with just a little more of a reflective question as we begin. The first question is, how does Christ influence how you use your resources? And so when they talk about being lukewarm, how it's useless if you're lukewarm. But if you're hot or cold, that can be useful and useful for the advancement of the gospel. And so when you think about this question, how is Christ going to be the one that's going to influence how we utilize our resources?
It's good. Brian should always talk first, just for clarity's sake, because and Joe mentions this in his sermon, so this might be repeat, but a lot of the sermons about lukewarm here I've heard are about salvation, about faith. Like you're either hot, like you're on fire for Jesus, or you're cold, like you say, I don't want anything to do with Jesus. And God prefers either of those more than the lukewarm Christian who says, I believe in Jesus, but does nothing, right? What
Kind
we're
of the apathy.
Yeah. What we're saying is that makes more sense in the text to say that it's not about whether or not you're saved, but how useful you are, and that the warm water and the cold water and the lukewarm water is worth nothing, right? It does nothing for you, so you spit it out of your mouth. So when we tie that to the Laodicean church, they had all the resources, but they were squandering them. They weren't focused on eternal things. They were wasting it. And so just making sure
That's
everybody
great.
remembers the connection. So we're talking about how, in a sense, has Christ influenced your resources in a positive way. So how are you basically not like the Laodicean church in a sense?
Yeah, when we talk about generosity, we usually talk about those three words of time, talent, and treasure.
Yep.
And we have all been blessed with those things to some extent. We all have the same amount of time. We all have some level of gifting or passion, and we all have some level of treasure. And I think if we want to be useful, I think it starts with having margin in our lives to be able to take the opportunities that are in front of us to be able to utilize those things. And so if we budget our time in such a way that every hour is spoken for, we're not going to use our time for Christ's lens because we don't have any time to do it. Same with money and the talent. I think a lot of times we just think about our talent as how can I make money or how can I benefit my family for this. And I think it's just having a different, I'm not speaking as personal yet, just more in broad terms of like, hey, what am I good at and how could I use those things for kingdom purposes? So
Margin so needed.
Yeah, it is. So if you were going to get personal and talk about how Christ has influenced the way you have used your time, talent, treasure, those resources, what are some of the things you think about?
Okay. So I grew up in a family that talked about tithing or talked about that. And so for my wife and I, that was just like the minimum, right? That was like when we get a job and get money, 10% goes to the church because we were kind of instilled with those values, and we've never felt bad about that. But then being challenged of like, it's also not a law that it has to be 10%. And so we've tried to add margin to come alongside, families that go to another place, or, I have a really, really good friend, someone that I got to mentor who's, off to the Middle East and getting to be a part of him going. Like that's a way of having the ability to participate in what's going on. Having been on the podcast for 2 weeks in a row, I kind of talked about an opportunity to go and speak somewhere. And like, that's talent, that's time.
And talent. Yeah.
And that's going, God has given me the ability to do this, and I'm going to say yes. And I'm going to take those things because it's probably more valuable than the things that I could fill it with.
Yeah.
So I kind of approach the question a little differently. Not that I agree with everything you said. For me, when I think about how does Christ influence how you use your resources, so he's the filter and the lens in which I look at how I'm using my time, talent, treasure, that type of a thing. But within that, I find it going two different ways. Of one, if I use that as my lens of I want to utilize all the things God has entrusted to me for the kingdom, I can easily go to a place of I'm failing, I'm falling short. Here's the things that I'm not doing. Here's the things that I need to be doing more of. We kind of talked about this as we were kind of thinking through this question, and it definitely resonated with me that when we approach topics, it can be so easy that we just keep adding more things that we should be doing and then looking at the areas that we're falling short. So you can even do a good thing of saying, man, I want to be like Christ. I want to use this as my filter, and then just see, man, I'm falling short. So then you're discouraged, overwhelmed, and then you're kind of like, I don't know if I really want to do that. But on the flip side, if I move to a place of Christ as my filter, and I'm not doing it out of a striving lens or how am I going to meet the mark, but more of a how can I just be more like Jesus and just be available and be selfless, then you don't look at it as all the ways you're coming up short. You look at all the opportunities that God did put in front of you and all the times that you were available to say yes, and then how God used that even more than you expected. And so I think, how do I view Christ in this? He's my lens, but then for me, it's even like that next step of as I use him as a lens, how do I use it as a lens through grace, through the gospel, so I can see it as opportunity and like joy from saying yes to things instead of just, man, I'm not measuring up in this.
I'm glad we built in the time between podcasts. I mean, between run through and podcast to have some time, because I was reminded of two big conversations this week that just get at the heart of this. And I'm trying to decide if it fits under that grace kind of perspective that you were just talking about. But I was golfing with a friend earlier this week, and he fits a lot of the descriptions of what the Laodiceans would say about themselves, right? Rich, prosperous, needing nothing. Great job, pays well, and has talked about wanting to retire soon, younger person, right? And was just going back and forth. And this idea of like, God has connected me to immense amount of resources. Like I'm getting this great salary, and I know that if I stay at this job, it's not something I love necessarily, right? Like I would like to leave and just be able to retire and do what I want. I don't love this job, but I know that I could use these resources for God, right? I could support missionaries and churches and nonprofits and charities, and I could really be used in a lot of great ways, but it would require me to stay at a place that's like, kind of life numbing at times. And so he's like, but honestly, I don't know what God wants from me in that sense. So it's that core question of, I believe that what Christ says is true. I believe the gospel is the most important thing, but I don't know if being attached to this world that is kind of a worldly place is worth the resources that I'm going to get to help other people. And I was like, man, I don't know either. That's fascinating. Pray. Hopefully the Holy Spirit helps you discern that. I know, like, I'm in the church world, and so I look at people in those circumstances and I'm like, dude, stay in your job. Like we could use your money to change the world. And like, we are not creating wealth on our own at all. So like we need people to be a light in the business world, and also to like reach that point where you're like, I don't need any of this. I'm going to give it all away. Right. Then there was a second conversation where there was a pretty wealthy family who had been planning for retirement, and their dream of retirement is get the lake house, right? Have a place to travel and visit with the kids. But recently the wife was feeling like maybe God was calling them to adopt, and that would require them to start all the way over, right? That would require them to put their finances into adopting, and then also their time into like raising a kid again, to start the whole process over. But it's like, I feel like God is leading me to do this. And both of these conversations are basically like I don't know what to do. I don't know if this is really what God's calling me to do, but I want to be willing to do it if that's what he's calling me to do. And I think the guilt and shame piece that I feel a lot from this conversation is something that Brian mentioned at the end of Run Through, which is like, there could always be more that you're doing. There could always be one more, as you said, person, one more percent, one more stuff that you could give more and more to. And so that sometimes feels like this burden of like, I'm just never going to live up to it. But the gospel piece of these conversations was simply, are you responding to what God has already done for you with open hands, because he will. It's really the comparison of the rich young ruler. Like if God were to look at you and say, are you willing to give everything up to follow me? If you can honestly look at God and be like, yes, I am, then I'm not telling you he has a specific plan for all the finances and resources he's given you. I'm just saying you're in the right spot. You are willing to give it all up for him. Now listen to how he wants you to use that and go from there. So you're right. It's less of the guilt of like, I know I always have more to do. I know I always have more to give, and more like are you willing to give everything? Are you willing to give all your time? Are you willing to, is that where your heart posture is at for Jesus as Lord? Okay. Then he's going to lead you into great opportunities and cool things that you can do, to kind of follow him.
I had a lunch with a guy yesterday, and he's been presented with an opportunity to go, and so he lives in Kansas City right now and works as a CPA, does a great job, has a good job, single. And the church that he's a part of, the pastor is going to be planning a church in Cincinnati, Ohio, and said, hey, I want you to come with me. I want you to be a part of planting this church, not as paid staff, but as handling the finances and a core person within us. And he just came to me like, what should I do? Like, I'm not finding a job over there right now. Like, I would have to literally move, quit my job, all this stuff. And so I really came down to, listen, are you called to this? Like, God has put you in a place that you actually have the flexibility that you could say yes to this. But being a part of church plant, it is going to be harder and more work than you think it is. Whatever you're being asked to do, it's just double it. Like, that's just what it's going to be. But if God has called you to this, then you're going to get into it, and you're going to find joy in all the things that you're going to be asked to do. God's going to work out the job because he's already prepared it before you. You may not make as much as you do. You may have to make a lot of sacrifices. You may not be as comfortable, but he'll open the doors. But if he hasn't called you to this and you make all these sacrifices and go there, then you're going to be miserable. And so sometimes, as looking at last week, when God opens these doors and we're being available and like pray, discern, like, what is God calling you to do?
Yeah.
I don't know if this is a helpful comment, but it feels like if you take like a 30,000 foot view of the letters to the 7 churches, the contexts are a little bit different. The realities are a little bit different. The circumstances are a little bit different. But the baseline question is like, are you going to be faithful in what you're being presented? And, if you're going through suffering, are you going to be faithful? If you have open doors, are you going to be faithful? If you have everything that you need, are you going to be faithful? And all of these circumstances you guys just talked about, these are awesome stories and opportunities for these people, and we don't know the right answer. But the question is, are you going to be faithful? And most likely they could be faithful adopting the kid or not adopting the kid, or staying in Kansas City or going to Cincinnati. But they have to figure out what they feel God is calling them to do, and then be faithful. Don't head forward and look back and try to see what you're missing out on. So
I love that. I'm like tempted to, my desire is always to have an answer for somebody, right? When they're desperately seeking big life advice, I want to be like, man, I know what it is. I'm just curious. I don't think maybe this isn't helpful, but if the decision is between staying in something that they know and being comfortable versus sacrificing something and being out of their comfort zone, do you normally lean towards one being a place where God works more easily with the person or whatever?
Okay, if I understand your question, so if one's comfortable, one's uncomfortable, that doesn't mean that the uncomfortable one is the thing you should do.
Yeah.
But the question you need to ask yourself is, am I willing to make the uncomfortable decision for the sake of the gospel? So maybe that door wasn't, so let's just use my friend's example. Let's say he's not supposed to go to Cincinnati, but he goes through this process and he says, I don't think that's the opportunity I'm supposed to do. But I am willing to be open to something that is uncomfortable like that. So then maybe there's something else then that pops up that they're like, I've been praying about being open and available, and man, as I went through the process, that wasn't it. But I knew that God was going to open up something else. So I think God can even use something that seems uncomfortable. And you don't have to feel like I should always do the uncomfortable thing. But are you willing to do the uncomfortable thing?
Do you think there's a way to know that you're really willing to do it without doing it? Like you just feel like your heart is in a place you'd be like, I promise I'm willing to do it.
I'm kind of a gut, and like once I'm convinced of something, I'm just going to do it. So I'm not sure if I'm the right person. Brian's just like shaking his head.
I'm not. I'm shaking my head that I'm
he's
like
also
in
a gut
agreement with
person.
you. Like I have a level of like I can discern when I feel peace about something, and I can discern when I don't. And if I feel peace about something, I'm like, yeah, I can move forward. And if I don't,
Gotcha. That's what the actual decision. If like like my thought after today was, if I was the rich young ruler, Jesus showed up to me. I said, "What must I do to be saved?" He said, you know, whatever. By the end of the conversation, one thing you haven't done, sell all you have and follow me. And he looked at me. Would I be willing to? Because my default mindset is, yeah, I'd be willing to. And then sitting down and really like, what does it look like to move from the idea that I'm willing to do it to like actually processing, okay, where would we live? And am I okay living in an apartment or on the street or being reliant on other people? So I don't know if it's helpful, but it's like, okay, I don't want to, this is my shame and guilt thing probably again, but I don't want to let people off the hook easily with the like, yeah, I'd be willing to give it all up, but I just don't know if that's what God's calling me to do. And not being like yeah, well, it's great that you're willing to. Be like, are you seriously willing to give up this insane job and your huge house and all the cars and really prove it? But I mean, I'm not going to say that. And I don't know if that's what God's really saying to them. I'm just like, how do you really know that you've gotten to that place of full unwillingness? Like if I told you,
I mean, everything's case by case, but it might be like, okay, how are you going to set your lifestyle up right now that
to
you
be
don't
ready
need
to
to
do that?
make the same income that you're making now? That you actually have the flexibility that you could make that shift. Things
That's
like
super practical. That's like real hands-on stuff there.
Yeah.
Okay.
and,
Again, I don't know if any of this conversation
and
is
leading
helpful,
is so important because you can write the end of both of those stories, right? You can, if I don't know who you're talking about, obviously, but if he is that successful in his business and he could retire and he could start a ministry, doing something. And so
great stuff.
the easy choice or the comfortable choice could lead to something else down the road. And so things are not always a fork in the road, wrong.
And that whole story is going to play out exactly as you think when you take that fork.
You can be unfaithful both ways, and you can be faithful both ways. How are you going to be faithful in the choice that you make?
Yeah.
Okay, so we've already shared some really good stories and examples of kind of what this looks like, but is the other question I had written, but we've kind of touched on it, is where have you used what God has entrusted to you for the kingdom? So I guess, are there other stories or other examples from you or other people of times when you were faithful and you used what God had entrusted to you?
What I mentioned right away, what comes to my mind most easily is the whole life path that we've chosen. So there comes a point where you choose to do ministry, knowing that it won't be the most financially lucrative, right, or simple or comfortable. And so I believe God's entrusted us with certain talents, and so to use those for Him is a sacrifice of treasure, generally, and of time. In some senses. Now, what was convicting to me today is like, there is a point at which I made that move and decision to be like, this is what I want to do with my life. I feel like God's calling me to ministry. But even, I mean, that initial big life decision, how did you just say it? I was just, there's faithfulness and unfaithfulness, in any way. Like I could be faithful in saying yes to God and choosing ministry, but like, I just realized today, like my mindset for a while has been, okay, you're making this amount of money. You need to be saving, and some of this is wisdom, but like you need to be saving this much for retirement so that at a certain point, here's my heart problem, you can stop doing ministry, start golfing, and just do whatever you want to do with your life, right? Eating out and all the things that I picture building towards are me-centered, pleasure-centered, self-centered. And so I just realized, man, my initial commitment to this job was done out of a faithfulness to like sacrifice these things. And then I find myself going back down the road to like, but there's still a way eventually that I can like choose a life that is self-centered. And so I was just feeling convicted today of like, okay, sometimes I do what God, like good things with what God's entrusted me to do. And sometimes I'm actually looking for myself.
So we met with a man in our church who thinks about like the end financially a lot. He helps people plan it, doesn't do it as a job, but just kind of as a hobby and a ministry. He goes in and meets with people. And so we met with him recently to talk through, what the future could look like. And I thought that was a really good conversation. And I'm not trying to be like you and me, But like when I think about the end, I don't want to be a burden to my children, and I don't want to be a burden to someone else or a system that has to take care of me. Like I want to plan those things well so that I'm not burdening someone else. And so I don't think doing those things in and of themselves are bad, but if we are the end of those things, like our focus is in the wrong place.
Yeah.
There's obviously going to be stories, and I don't catalog who we talk about on the podcast, and so I'm hesitant to share this one just because I feel like he gets talked about a lot. But I look at someone like Rich McKee, who lived his life in such a way that now he has retired. He's not concerned about finances, but he works basically full time doing Young Life and stuff for our church. I mean, he's leading the section leader ministry at our church. He's serving on the elder board. He meets with men. He has a group on Tuesday mornings, and he lived his life in such a way that now he is devoting almost full time to ministry. And so that is a person who I would say has taken the resources that God has given him and is using those for kingdom purposes.
Yeah. When I think about my own life and story, I look at my upbringing with my parents and grew up in upper class, and my parents had a big home and big yard, all this stuff. And I think they modeled this really, really well. They let us have camp in their yard. They had crud wars for Young Life. I mean, elder meetings used to be out there. I mean, it just seemed like my friends would always be over there. They wanted to utilize that space for the kingdom and made it super open, super available. So again, I think if you have resources, I mean, the friend that you're talking about, I think my parents did a good example of this. There's many people that use that for the kingdom, and it's awesome. And then with me being in ministry, my house is not as big as my parents' was. There's just a lot of things that my parents did that I'm not able to do. And so I think if you're someone like me that has a house that doesn't have a huge living room, doesn't have a huge dining room, it can be like, okay, well, what can I actually do? And I think, and then raising kids and stuff, you can start being like, I don't know if I have a role to play. But it's simple things for us have been, we invested in a nice playground. We have a nice backyard and a nice playground. And so our playground is the place where the neighborhood kids come over and play. And
Really?
so we might just
Already?
be
That's so
playing
sweet.
and our neighbors from across the way have 3 little boys and they'll say, hey, can we come over and play? Come on over. Like, let's go play on the playground. And we just have
Nice.
a sweet time. My wife is really good at being super intentional at calling, texting, just people, especially women that maybe have gone through similar struggles or different things that she has. So she doesn't have a ton of time, but she's super intentional with how she does that. So I think it can be easy to look at, what are the things that we don't have? But I think look at what do you have and how can you use those, even if it feels small,
Yeah, that's great.
for the kingdom as well. So I think there's kind of this both sides, right? Of, I've got all this. Is my heart in the right place and everything? And also, well, I don't have a lot. I don't think this applies to me. And no matter where you feel like you're at,
that's great.
God can use you.
Yeah. And I especially think if you don't have some of the treasure, which is easy for us to think about, a lot of times that transfers into maybe you have more time. Right? And I think everybody has a similar amount of talent, right? So I'm just thinking of and if you don't have the yard to give over to Young Life for crud wars, right? Anyway, maybe you have time to give to volunteering or serving your neighborhood or loving people well, something like that.
Yeah, it just seems to be this conversation seems to be coming down to perspectives. Are you looking out for yourself? Or are you looking out for God's interest and the interest of others? And I mean, just really simply the great commandment. We're to love the Lord our God. We're to love other people the way we love ourselves. And if we're spending most of our time, talent, and treasures on us, that should be an alarm that's going off. And if we are using our time, talent, and treasure, not fully and all and everything like that, but just if we're willing to part with stuff because we're not defined by it.
Yeah.
Like I think then we can say, hey, we're being faithful in this way.
Okay, as we wrap up this episode, give me a final thing that's rising to the top for you. Maybe it's from the passage, from Joe's message, or a discussion here. What's kind of your final, either maybe question that you're pondering leaving from here, or maybe a final thing that really like convicted you, or a next step that you wanted to take?
do more so God will love me more. Don't take that away. What are you thinking, Brian?
Yeah, I don't know if I have a full final thought. I really like the stories you guys shared earlier about these people who are wrestling with real life decisions. And it feels like there's a Jesus component to what they're wrestling with. And I think if Jesus could enter into the decision making of our people, I'm not trying to get them to wear a WWJD bracelet.
Unless that would help.
But I am going, wow, God, I have this opportunity. Let me put this before you before I react, and let me see what you would have me do, and how I can be faithful with whatever the decision might be. I think if people took that away from this, that would be really helpful.
Mine is super practical. We've had conversations lately about supporting a couple people that we're excited to support, but it requires me to actually sift through our budget and make a new budget plan in a sense. And I've just put that off for a month, basically. This is a good reminder to be like, take some time, sit down and actually do that, because it's going to help some people. And it just really refocuses my heart on what's important. Every time I do that, it's like, oh yeah, this is the stuff that I spend my money on, generally not important. The stuff that I'm giving my money to for the sake of the kingdom, so much more important. And so I need to just take the time to do that.
Cool. Yeah, I think the faithful obedience piece that Brian's been talking about of just having that be the lens and perspective that we approach this. And then I also think the practical thing of, as I'm beginning to start thinking about retirement and that type of thing, what is my end goal and what's my end picture? Is it my own comfort, or is it something bigger than that that's more kingdom focused? So, all right, guys, thanks for this discussion. Brian, would you pray for our church family?
Will do. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you for your word, and thank you for these letters to these churches, and just the way that you called out to them to be faithful, and you knew what they were doing. Father, you know what we're doing. There's nothing that we can hide from you. It doesn't matter if we put on our best answer or if we make everything look real nice. You know who we are. And so, Father, I pray that we would just stop hiding, and that we would live in what is real, and that we would just seek to be faithful men and women with what you have given us, with the time that we have, and with the place that we're living in. And so, Father, I pray that the church would hear not only the words of this podcast, but the words of the letter to the church at Laodicea this weekend, and they would be convicted the way you need to convict them, and that they would make decisions to follow you. In Jesus' name we pray, amen.
Amen. Doug, Brian, thanks for being a part of this discussion. Doug, you're going to be able to finish your Chick-fil-A sandwich in here in just a second. So, church family, thank you for listening to this episode of the Deeper Podcast. We look forward to see you all next time.